and turn things over to our presenter, Jean Lofgren. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I thought I'd start with my background a little bit, and then rather than have it be like a straight presentation, if it's more conversational, I don't know how that will work, but feel free to interrupt with any questions if anybody has anything. So my name is Jean Lofgren. I'm the principal of BEntities LLC. My day job is a lawyer. I've been practicing law for 20 years. I spent the first 13 years of my practice doing primarily bankruptcy and commercial restructuring work for large law firms. And about 7 years ago, I hit a reset button on my legal career, and I moved from an international law firm of 1,800 attorneys to a boutique business law firm with about 5 attorneys. And I still do a lot of commercial restructuring and bankruptcy work, but in the move, my practice became more generally focused on businesses, so that I was doing day-to-day contracts, governance type issues, as well as entity choice and formation. And so to make myself competent to represent people on entity choice and formation, I actually read the Pennsylvania business corporation law from start to finish. And I came across benefit corporations in that process. And it's the first time I had heard of them. These are businesses that make a public commitment to having a material positive impact on society and the environment. And it's a concept that really spoke to me. And I kind of made it my personal mission to educate our local bar and also entrepreneurs in the startup community in Pittsburgh, where I'm from, on these business entities, because everyone I had talked to hadn't heard of them. And I did that for a couple years and kind of ran into the same roadblocks in discussing benefit corporations and certified B Corps. One of which is, why would you want to get certified? What's the value in it? I'm a busy entrepreneur. Why would I want to add another thing onto the list of things to do? And so I decided to start BEntities LLC for a couple reasons. One, through my law practice, I was helping business owners go through the assessment and had really gained a lot of familiarity with the assessment. It is comprehensive, it's nuanced. And so I just felt like I could add value that way. And the second reason was to get a real practical understanding of what was involved with reporting obligations. And although BEntities is kind of a side consulting business for me, I was adding these reporting obligations in the impact assessment in addition to my full-time job as a lawyer and raising 2 kids and the community service activities that I do. So I felt like it was comparable. Just to have a real practical understanding of what was involved with it. So that's my background. My approach to the B impact assessment and certified B corporations has kind of evolved in the last 7 years. Initially, I was really focused on the assessment aspect. I had a tagline, was BEntities impact assessment at the grassroots level, trying to make it easier for smaller businesses to be able to go through the B impact assessment and get certified as B corporations. And again, kind of hitting similar roadblocks along the way. Having the view of the B impact assessment being just a measuring tool, it shifted for me from being, it's all about the number, to the way the impact assessment is set up. It's more about the qualitative approach to the impact assessment. So you're integrating practices based upon whether they're a natural fit for your company as opposed to what your score might be. So now the tagline for my business is raising the collective one practice at a time. Just to kind of, are you guys generally familiar with B corporations and certified and benefit companies and what the differences are? So just so we're using the same lingo. certified B corporations, it's a certification. It's not a type of legal entity. You have to have at least 80 points or higher on the B impact assessment in order to get certified. And your B impact assessment score has to be verified by B Lab, which is the nonprofit that runs the certification process. And you have to have in your corporate governance documents a commitment to having a material positive impact on society and the environment. And with benefit companies, that's state specific. And I'm going to speak when I talk about state legislation and benefit corporations and benefit limited liability companies. I'm going to do it from the Pennsylvania law perspective. It does change depending on what state you're in. They're not the same at all. So if your entity is organized outside of Pennsylvania, what I say won't necessarily apply to you. But for benefit companies in Pennsylvania, you have a reporting requirement and you do need to do an impact assessment, but there's no specific requirement that you get a particular score on the B impact assessment, or there's no requirement that you take the B impact assessment in order to do your assessment. So they're a little more flexible in terms of your the positive impact that you have and the number that you need in order to qualify as a benefit company. And then the third term, which is a new term, is BEntities. And that's the one that I coined, and that's the one that deals with taking the qualitative approach to the B impact assessment. So I consider anybody that's integrating the B impact assessment into their business operations to be a B entity, regardless of what your score is, and regardless of whether you're intending to make a public commitment to positive impact or not. And the reason for that is because of how the B impact assessment is structured. And I feel like it adds a lot of value to an organization, regardless of, what your history is, what your understanding is of the purpose and the reason why we organize as human beings and we conduct our business. And also, in the conversations that I've had over the last 7 years discussing these concepts, I would get a lot of blank stares, and I'd get a lot of people feeling like, if they weren't near an 80-point score on the B impact assessment, and maybe they weren't even at the industry average of 50 points on the B impact assessment, that somehow they're bad, and that they would reject the concept outright and not take an opportunity to integrate the assessment and have just the positive benefits of implementing 1 or 2 practices a year. So BEntities is meant to be a much larger, all-encompassing group of organizations that are implementing the B impact assessment slowly over time and without respect to score, if that makes sense. So with that, I'll get into kind of the details of the B impact assessment. And again, as I run through stuff, if you have any specific questions, either about the assessment itself and what's involved with it, or with the legal requirements for certification for a B corporation or setting yourself up as a benefit corporation, feel free to jump in and ask, and I'll answer.
Oh, just wanted to jump in. I think Benjamin had a question in the chat. He said, are there any other certifications other than B Corp that would apply to benefit corporations?
So you can have a number of different certifications concerning particular products that you might use, or aspects like fair wages, fair trade, women owned, things like that. And those can apply to segments of the business that you run. The difference with the B Corp certification is that it's an all-encompassing look at your business and the kind of 5 key stakeholder interests and how you impact like all 5 key stakeholders. So it's really a certification of how you're doing business as opposed to any particular aspect of your business. So again, just think of it as being more comprehensive. And to my knowledge, I'm not aware of another certification that takes such a comprehensive view of an organization. That said, if you are a benefit corporation, you can use another third-party assessment. You don't have to use the B impact assessment. If you want to be a certified B corporation, you have to use the B impact assessment. So hopefully I answered that. So the 5 key areas that the B impact assessment looks at are your governance policies and practices, kind of how you interact with the community, how you engage your employees, how you steward the environment, and then B Lab, their 5th category is how you engage with your customers. But for me, I usually think of it as how, what you're doing with your suppliers. There's a lot of questions on the assessment that are geared at trying to remove exploitation gradually out of your supply chain. And so I pull out suppliers and emphasize that more than customers, typically when I'm dealing with companies going through the assessment. Um, it's a it's a super tailored assessment. So the last time I inquired with B Lab about it was a couple years ago, and at that time they had 78 different versions of the B impact assessment. And the reason for that is they want to give you a real apples to apples, oranges to oranges comparison on how your business is doing in comparison to similarly situated businesses. So when you fill out a profile to take the assessment, it asks you what industry you're in, what sub-industry you're in, how many employees that you have. And so that's how they're able to funnel it down. And that's why they have so many different versions of the impact assessment. And then the structure of the assessment, I think of it as being a kind of a loose structure, even though it's very comprehensive. It's in a multiple choice format. So you're asked a question in one of the 5 key areas, and then you're given a list of anywhere from 5 to 10 different like business practices, and you check all that apply to your business operations. And each one of those practices is kind of I think of them as like a best practice for your business organization. So each one of them, if you decide to start implementing over time into your business operations, is going to have some sort of positive impact. Do I want to screen share? No.
I was just wondering if you had any slides that you wanted to reference.
Yeah, I do. And then I just kind of started jumping through and jumping into it.
No
So
worries,
here,
no worries.
on here. So the tagline now is raising the collective one practice at a time instead of focusing again on the impact assessment and getting a particular number. Although my view of the B impact assessment has changed over time, the assumptions that underlie why I do this and why my company exists, those have always been constant. And it's the idea that we're all interconnected. So how we treat each other matters. And that the power of human imagination and activity through collective enterprise is boundless. And I feel like the versatility with the B impact assessment and how it's structured and the effect of implementing it over time really funnels into those 2 main assumptions. And then I ran through the basics of the different terminology. So as you hear me refer to certified B Corps and benefit companies and B entities, you kind of have context for what I was talking about. So we're on multiple choice format, check all that apply. Yeah, so again, so it's a list of best practices. As you check things that apply, you can see a little point tally at the bottom of your question, either go up and down depending on your the number of boxes that you're checking that apply. And it's just, I'll explain a little bit later, like how that rolls into why you might want to start integrating the assessment into your business operations. Again, whether or not you have any desire to become a certified B corporation or make any type of public facing statement. So the 2 approaches, and the one that I took for the first 4 years was a quantifiable approach based upon, focusing on impact assessment, focusing on what your score would be, and with the goal of becoming a certified B corporation. And I would come to some similar and common roadblocks. One, as I indicated a little bit earlier, as an entrepreneur who's very busy, why would you want to add something else to your list? But then even for companies that were really dead set, business owners in particular that really did set on making this happen for their company and getting the certification, and who went through the assessment with me and had a fantastic score. And we documented all of their answers. They even went through the review process. Um, but their investor, wouldn't be on board with it because it was such a new concept. And I feel somewhat responsible with as being a lawyer too. A lot of lawyers aren't familiar with these business entities. And so, if you have an investor client that comes to you that says, hey, I want to invest in this company, but the business owner wants to set it up as a benefit corporation or get a B Corp certification. If the lawyer's not familiar with it and it hears reporting obligations and, public commitments, it can get kind of, there's a tendency to be risk adverse and recommend that you not do that. So those were the most common roadblocks I saw. With a qualitative approach to implementing the B impact assessment, you don't kind of have those same issues because again, it's about the assessment and integrating that into your operations slowly over time. And then, as you're gradually implementing these practices and you see your score go up and up and up, I think it becomes less of an issue for people who might have been hesitant to make that last final commitment to changing the corporate governance documents. You're just doing it on a slow and incremental basis. So it's kind of like the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step and working that way, as opposed to having a set, I need 80 points. I'm at 35. There's no point. I'm not even going to bother type deal. But importantly, whether you're more focused and emphasized on a quantifiable approach or the qualitative approach, both of them kind of have the same net result, which is you're going from a single shareholder wealth maximization business model to a more multi-stake key stakeholder approach model. And it's in that transition going from having a singular focus to the multi-stakeholder focus is where you're really making the positive impact, whether you want to commit to it or not, you're actually doing it. So why integrate the B impact assessment? These are my 5 reasons that I came up with: visibility, a roadmap, engagement, awareness, and big picture. So starting with visibility, these slides, they derive from my website, and on the website, there are links to a lot of what's mentioned in here. And so like if you want to have, what's a certified B Corp in the view of B Lab, that runs that whole process, there's links to B Lab's website, there's links to the B Corporation website, and the 2 studies that are mentioned here, there's links in there. So there's a wealth of information and additional resources on the website if you really want to delve in to more details. But the idea behind visibility is that more people want to know how your business is done. It used to be they cared just about price, then they started looking at what's the quality of the ingredients making up the thing that I'm eating. And now people are asking more, well, what were the wages paid, in the food for the people that work to get the food and bring it to me. 2007, the Goldman Sachs study, it found for the first time that the majority of people determine brand loyalty and purchasing choices based upon a corporate social responsibility practices of the business as opposed to just price. And they found also that that was particularly true of individuals who are younger than the baby boomer generation, and then also for women. And then that study, coupled with the fact that there's a projected $30 trillion wealth transfer to happen to millennials and to women over the next decade, 2 decades or so, you can see where it's going. That the consumer base is going to most likely continue to become more conscientious of their purchasing decisions. You had a raised hand?
Yeah, hi, it's Tom Dameron. So do you see the risk of a B Corp and the perception or risk to, from an investor's standpoint, actually going down over time because the customer does expect better out of the companies that they deal with? Thank you.
Yeah, so I absolutely do, for a couple of reasons. One, there's going to be increased, and there has been, like almost, there's been a ridiculous increase in the amount of interest in social impact investing over time, and so you're seeing more people wanting to put their money in funds that take socially responsible practices into consideration. And then in addition to that, just as time ekes on, more and more people are becoming familiar and educated on these types of models and what's involved. So I do think that that's a roadblock that will wear away in time. And you know, I don't know how quickly and if it happens in a flood or not, but there's definitely a lot more social impact investing going on now than there was in 2007 when the study was written, or even in 2014 and 2015 when I was making all my speeches and whatnot. So it's definitely, and I used to track the number of certified B corporations on a monthly basis. I stopped tracking it about a year ago, but month to month, you saw a 1 to 3% increase in the number of certified B Corps in like a 5-year period. So there was never a spike, but there was always steady growth, if that makes sense. And then down here where I have CSR policy versus a BIA score, that again goes along with the notion that as the consumer base becomes more educated and more aware, a CSR policy is usually what a corporation wants to present a snapshot of itself, and it's an aspect of its business that it wants to highlight. It's not a comprehensive score versus a B impact assessment score, where I know for myself as a consumer, that's something that I look for. You know, you're less inclined to get greenwashed if you've got a company that's gone through a comprehensive assessment of all of its operations and then has some sort of published score. So the second reason I had down was a roadmap, passing through sustainability on the way to positive impact. And again, this is based upon how the impact assessment is structured, with it being open-ended, multiple choice questions, and checking all that applies. So there are a list of best practices, they're weighted for impact. So you can just kind of pick and choose what makes sense for your company, either in the sphere of, you know, employee engagement or community partnership, governance practices that you might want to implement or think make sense to implement, and do it, you know, over time in your own way. And with the assessment, the more practices you can check, the higher your assessment score. And so at some point while you're whether you are shooting for positive impact or not, you know, you might just be shooting for sustainability, but you're going to pass through it on the way. And so, you know, it's just, again, it's a nice way to help a business owner or company who wants to start being more cognizant of environmental issues or community issues, to slowly in time integrate practices that make sense for them. Engagement. So a big focus of some of the questions on the impact assessment deal with your employees and how you communicate back and forth with employees. It asks whether or not you have like a 360-degree review process, whether you share, you know, certain financial information with your employees, and then also how the questions are structured. The list of best practices that you can check off if they apply, they don't tell you how to do things, they just ask if you do things. So one of the questions might be, you know, do you spend any volunteer time, any paid time, or do you give paid time off for volunteer time? And so you can check yes or no. And if you want to check yes, and that's a practice that you want your company to maybe look to integrate this year, one, you can talk to your employees about it. what charities are they most interested in? Which ones do they want to volunteer their time for? Take an afternoon or a day off and go out and do it. And it's just, it's a nice way to engage your employees. Also within, stewarding the environment, there's a lot of different options there. Maybe at the management level, you kind of clarify 2 or 3 or 4 different options that the company is looking at doing, and then you engage your employees to ask which ones they feel is more important. But there's just a host of ways in which you can bring your employees' voices into how your company ends up interacting with all of these other key stakeholders in their business model. And what's neat is that, no employee base is going to be the same. And so in the process of engaging your employees in this manner, you really start to kind of develop almost like a soul to the company that you're not going to find anywhere else. And then awareness is the 4th reason I have listed for why you might want to engage or integrate the impact assessment. There were a number of entrepreneurs that would take, that they considered themselves to be socially and environmentally minded, but wouldn't engage in the impact assessment. And it just caused me to kind of scratch my head because, how, at the end of the day, how do you know if you have a socially and environmentally responsive business model if you don't take the opportunity to see what's out there, what practices are available, and what you're doing in relation to what might be good practices to implement. And then even if you did kind of have a good idea that you had a socially and environmentally sound business model, again, how the B impact assessment is structured, there's things that probably didn't think of that you could be doing. And I say that from experience. There's a number of different entrepreneurs that I went through the assessment with, and they'd say, no, we don't do that, but you certainly could do that. And there's no reason why we wouldn't do that or shouldn't do that. So they got a lot of great ideas out of running through the assessment for things that they could be doing with their business. Yeah, so it's an opportunity that if you want to be a socially and environmentally conscious business, it's an opportunity to really enhance that impact overall. And then the last reason I have for why you would want to integrate the B impact assessment is big picture, finding balance, right? So with the main assumption that we're all interconnected, kind of flows that if you focus singularly on one item, whether you're focusing on profit or if you're focusing on a mission, and you're not looking at other sectors that are impacted by your operations, it could potentially result in an absurd situation. So for example, if your shareholder wealth maximization, like for-profit driven, you could be creating a scenario where, you need to set up a nonprofit to address an inequity that was created because you just were looking at, your particular profit. And, on the flip side, you could be a nonprofit that's totally mission driven and you're not paying attention to your employees' situation, and you're creating a situation for your employees where, it's not sustainable for them to continue to work at the organization, even though they're really impassioned by what you're doing. So by integrating the impact assessment into a business operation, it gives you an opportunity to keep all those stakeholder interests in mind and create a balanced strategy. And then the last bullet point there with the enhancing long-term viability, the Certified B Corporation is a relatively new certification, and benefit corporations are relatively new business models. But a lot of the companies that are certified B corporations, they've been in business for decades, if not generations, employing these types of practices. And they show, that these types of models really do have long-term viability and incredible brand loyalty as well. So I could list some of my favorite companies are certified B corporations, Dr. Hauschka Skincare, Patagonia, Dr. Bronner's. And again, these are businesses that have been around for a really long time. Did anybody have any questions at all? Let's see. Anything specific about the assessment? I'll sometimes get questions about how the assessment can help foster inclusivity and kind of equity between and among people within the organization. And some of the questions are really geared towards that. So for example, it promotes a more equitable distribution of profits by asking questions like, are you paying a living wage? And if so, how much do you pay over the living wage? What's the ratio between the highest paid employee and the lowest paid employee? And the lower the ratio, the more points that you get on the certification. And then generally with procurement policies with your suppliers, it asks if you're giving any preferences to independently owned businesses, women-owned businesses, or businesses owned by traditionally underrepresented segments of the population. And it also asks, not just on ownership, but with the executive committee, how much of the executive committee is underrepresented segments of the population and things like that. So if you're also looking to try to have a more equitable distribution and representation within the organization, the B impact assessment is something that at least helps you think through those things as well. I don't know if anybody is already set up as a benefit corporation or a certified B corporation, and if they're nervous at all about the reporting obligations. I attached back here, this is a copy of the annual benefit report that I file for BEntities. And the reason why I attached it is just to demonstrate that it doesn't have to be a work of art to satisfy the reporting requirements. I know that there are a lot of companies that will have an impact assessment officer that's kind of designated, and they have like a team of people that can just put together this beautiful presentation. And it's wonderful because it tells a story and it's a big part of that company. But for me, I needed to get bare bones and get, kind of comply and get through it. And I feel as though my report does tell the story of my company, but it's particularly after this is my third report that I've filed publicly. So this one didn't take very much time at all to put together. And then the first one maybe took a few hours based upon having gone through the assessment the first time. And that's another thing that I would mention. The ramp up going through the assessment the first time is hard, right? But after you get through it the first time, all your questions populate over into the next year's assessment. And it's not nearly as difficult. You won't, I'll stop screen sharing. Unless you somebody raise their hand. Did someone raise their hand?
Oh, I did, but
Oh, sorry.
definitely. I just was going to say that Alan had a question in the chat.
Oh, okay.
He asked, what type of benefit entity do you recommend for new companies? And then also, what are the deciding factors for a company to choose a format?
Great questions. So the most flexible model for a benefit company would be a benefit limited liability company. Pennsylvania has two. You can organize yourself as a benefit corporation or as a benefit limited liability company. And whether you organize as a corporation or an LLC, it's the same as if you do a traditional versus a benefit. The only difference tax-wise, real in like structure-wise, is that the benefit, if you do the benefit designation, you sign up for a reporting obligation, and you have to have in your corporate governance documents that you're going to make a public commitment to a material positive impact on society and the environment. I would say importantly, the statutes that create the benefit corporation and benefit LLC model say there's no cause of action if you fail to create a positive impact on society and the environment, and that nobody has standing. There's no third-party beneficiary standing for somebody to sue you because they feel that you didn't create your positive impact. So the folks that wrote the legislation really went out of their way to make sure that people making this commitment weren't really subjecting themselves to additional liability for some third-party unknown. You know, if they make the election and decide to kind of stick their necks out and proceed this way. And as far as I know right now, there's no consequence for not filing an annual benefit report. I have not seen a company yet lose their status as a benefit LLC or benefit corporation because they failed to file their annual benefit report. So it's just, you do the best you can at this point, I think. And then what was the second part of the question? Is it in the chat?
Yeah, it was what are the deciding factors for a company to choose a format?
So are you interested in deciding whether or not to be a benefit company or a regular traditional one, or trying to decide between being an LLC versus a corporation?
It's really for advising of startups and what the right match is depending on the characteristics of the startup.
Yeah, so a LLC it's the most flexible one with the least corporate formality. You can do an LLC and put in the language that's necessary if they want to make an election later to be a benefit company and incur the reporting obligations. So for several people, I've set them up as an LLC that have this commitment to a multi-stakeholder approach language in their organizational documents. But when we've filed for the state, we did not make the election for them to be a benefit LLC, so that they did not trigger a responsibility to go through their impact assessment and to go through reporting obligations. That's the easiest one. That's the one that people are most comfortable with. I do recommend and like that they continue to integrate the B impact assessment. So I'm a little bit different how I counsel my clients. I actually take them through the assessment, and then we decide whether or not that's something they want to commit to going forward. And so a lot of them check no. But I think they also get the benefit of having gone through the assessment in the sense that they know where they choose to bank matters. So for example, I set my company up so that I bank at an independent community-owned bank, and it's worth 7 points on the B impact assessment, which people who have committed a lot of time and effort decided that, you know, that it's worth it, that what a community, independently owned community bank means for a community is huge, because of their commitment to invest and take the money that they're earning off of my company and put it back in for the benefit of their community. And then just, you know, who I pick to do my graphic, who I pick to do our accounting services, stuff like that. I mean, that's all kind of helped me be more conscientious in my choice of vendors from the start. So again, you know, for me, the gold at the end of the rainbow isn't necessarily the B Corp certification or your particular score. It's having gone through the assessment, seeing what's available, and deciding what's right for your company, and getting a lot of really great, again, ideas. Yeah.
You've mentioned a time commitment a couple times. What for a new company starting out, very few employees, what kind of time commitment is there to administer, you know, if you're actually going to go for the whole B Corp certification?
So So what I did when I worked with companies that are similarly situated to what you're talking about, I would schedule in hour increments, and there's usually we were done in 3 weeks and no more than 4, going through the assessment together a chunk at a time. And the benefit of having somebody that's familiar with it go through it with you is you avoid some of the common mistakes that are made when going through the assessment. So for example, if you read the questions too fast, you might miss that there is a time restriction. You know, it's what environmental attributes did you do over the last 24 months to enhance water conservation in your building or something like that. And they'll answer something from that they did 5 years ago. So it's just slowing people down to make sure that they get the nuances, making sure that they don't double count practices. So if you counted volunteer time, for example, as a way of engaging your employees, then you're not then doing it with your community partnership type stuff. And then making sure that you're answering from the company level and not as the charitable donations that you might make as an entrepreneur. So there's, and just the familiarity of going through those questions. It takes about 3 to 4 hours. And then if you want to document, like if you want to go for the certification, you have to have your responses documented. A lot of the documentation can come through your employee handbook. You just add different things within the employee handbook and you enhance it to have it in writing that way. There's a concept of your significant suppliers, which is 80% of essentially your costs of doing business, the 4 or 5 that make up the volume of your cost of doing business. And there's a lot of questions about, whether they're independent, different characteristics, what's your spend with them, where does your revenue get generated from? And so there's some charts and things like that that you have to go through either your general ledger and figure out how they fall into those different categories, so that then you can make the calculations and answer the questions. So it depends. It's one of the reasons why I set up BEntities LLC is to help business owners not spin their wheels while they're trying to go through the assessment. And then once you go through it, that initial time, going through it a second time, the next year, it's not nearly as much of a commitment because 1, you're already familiar with the questions. 2, you've already kind of put in the framework for it. And a lot of times what we do after we finish the first time through is just create a checklist of what we, goals we want to implement, things we want to do over the next year. And it flows a lot easier the second time you look at it because you go back to those practices that you wanted to implement. You either check them off because you did, or you leave it alone, or add it to a to be continued and implemented this year type thing. Yeah, so I would say the ramp up is for doing it the first time is the time commitment, the big one. And then a couple years ago, it would take about 3 to 5 months once you did your review call. So you would submit your B impact assessment, and then you would get scheduled for a review call within a week or so, or 3 weeks maybe. And then it would take anywhere from 4 to 6 months to get certified, go through the review process, make sure that B-Lab had what they needed, in order to make the certification. And now most recent check is it's 5 to 7 months even before you can get a review call with B-Lab. And then presumably, depending on the state of your responses and whether you've kind of overestimated or you didn't pick up a nuance in one of the questions, or you don't have something documented quite right, that can take and lengthen the process to get the certification.
So there's another question in the chat from Benjamin. He says, you mentioned 80% of suppliers, do they use GAAP definitions for COGS? Sorry if I'm not saying the acronyms correctly.
Cost of goods sold.
Yeah, and various other accounting terms, or do B Corp certifications have their own specific definitions?
So I can answer that they have their own specific definition for what constitutes a local supplier, which is 50 miles, and that's not very far and wide. So for example, I think you can certify something as being locally grown if it's within a 7-hour truck drive, which is a lot, wider of a scope than 50 miles. I'm going off recollection. The suppliers, it goes by, your revenues and the amount of revenue that is spent on, I want to say it's 80% of your revenues and how those are kind of divvied out, because they don't want to know everything about every supplier that you have, but they want to know the ones that are really, key to your organization. Are those folks that you've vetted for negative practices, vetted for positive practices, and are you giving any type of procurement preference to businesses that are owned by traditionally underrepresented segments of population?
And also it's like an international organization too, so it wouldn't just be GAAP. Everybody, their
Yeah,
definitions would have to work for IFRS and all those things too. So I guess
yeah, they have a standards advisory council, which is responsible for excuse me, determining what constitutes a positive practice and what the value is for it. And they have that council broken up into two segments. One is for developed markets, and not just in the US, like any, international developed market. And then they have another one that's specific for emerging markets.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, so they have their bases pretty well covered. And I imagine they're incredibly busy, which is why it takes so long to get a review call.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. A common question I get is if there's any tax advantages to being a benefit corporation or a certified B corporation. Excuse me. Federally, no, and generally speaking, no. But my understanding is that Philadelphia does provide a local tax credit for certified B corporations. And last I checked, it was like $10,000 a year, which is a nice incentive to offset any expense that you might incur, in becoming a certified B corporation. But the idea was that, you're not doing it for tax purposes, you're doing it for other principled reasons.
To piggy off of the tax, are there any grants that you could use your B Corp certifications to try and get any assistance with grants or any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I think as the nonprofit community is getting more familiar with social enterprises and therefore certified B corporations, they're starting to become more comfortable with the idea of using kind of sponsors in between, and they'll sponsor another type of almost incubator organization that then funnels money to the different social enterprises.
Actually, that makes sense. I guess it would look good on a nonprofit to say that it supports B Corps.
With that?
I guess it would look good for a nonprofit to say it supports B Corps.
Yeah, and they can be very compatible. So, a nonprofit that generates revenue can, to the extent they run into issues of having to pay taxes on the revenue and how that affects their nonprofit status and whatnot, a lot of them can spin off the revenue generating entity into a B corporation, and then just have the two separate. And then I believe I'm not giving tax advice, so all disclaimers there. But I believe there is a IRS tax ruling or opinion that says if you can show that the money going from the certified B Corp to support the nonprofit has some reasonable basis to benefit economically the certified B Corp, that it's tax deductible. And so it's a mechanism for certified B corporations to make tax deductible expenditures to charity or nonprofits. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I actually had a quick question. So what really struck me was when you were saying that there's going to be a big like wealth transfer upcoming to like the millennial population, and I was wondering, so with these like certifications, the certain questions that are asked, do they ever become like updated or changed throughout time with, as new issues come and arise?
Yeah, so they're constantly being reviewed and updated, and then they're put out for public comment. I can't remember what version that they're on with the B impact assessment. The last one I did, I think, was a version 6 or 7, but like every 5 years, they'll give you a whole new version. But they're able to populate your prior answers to the questions that still are relevant to the new version. And so it's not like you're doing a whole new ramp up again to address whatever new issues are involved. And just as an example, the most recent B impact assessment that I did in order to generate my annual benefit report for this year, there was a list of maybe 10 or so different disclosure questions that were new that I had to say whether they applied or not. So it is constantly evolving. It's not like a one and done endeavor at all. And I would say the only time that you're really looking at maybe a similar situation to having to put as much time into the B impact assessment as you did when you first went through it is if you go through a fundamental corporate change, company change, that puts you in a whole different category. So for example, with BEntities, it's just me. I don't have any employees. As a founder, I don't count as an employee. So I have a very specific set of B impact assessment questions. When I start having employees, then I get put into a whole different bucket, and there's a whole new list of questions that apply, and I'll need to answer those for the first time. But all my governance questions, as they related to how I set my company up and stuff like that, those will get transferred over. Does that make sense?
Definitely. Thank you.
Mhm.
So I understand for a certified B Corp that a new company has some leeway when is it when you're first incorporating, or how do they look at new companies? I think I read something like within your first year.
Yeah, so there's a pending B Corp certification that you can get. And that's if you don't have a full year of operations to support your answers to your B Lab question, your B impact assessment questions. And then the idea is that if you get the certificate pending, or certification pending, that within a set number of months that could be extended up to a year, you confirm that you're going to be able to get the full-blown certification. So that's for startups.
So you say that you need a full year of operations. So
Yeah, to be a fully certified B Corporation with full access to kind of members' benefits and their
right.
network
So
and everything.
if my company's been in existence, I've been working on a product, but the product has actually not launched. Would it be a full year after launch? How do you think that would work?
Yeah, so they actually, I think because they're so busy, they've implemented yet another requirement just to get your assessment reviewed, and that's that you have at least one full-time employee devoting at least 35 hours a week to your business operations. So that's one segment, and then it's 12 months of financial history that they're looking at. So what your revenues are, because it's part of the questions are, where have you generated your revenues from? Who, is it local? Is it coming from outside? And then your expenses, who's benefiting from the work that you're doing in your business. So I would say it would be a year after you launch.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any more questions? I think, Jean, in the chat, I did see a question if you wouldn't mind
Oh,
providing
yeah,
your
sure.
contact info.
So my name is Jean Lofgren. And then the address is connect@BEntities.com. And then the website is BEntities. That work?
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Yeah, so if there's no more questions, Jean, I just want to say thank you so much for running this session. I
Yeah.
really enjoy learning about all this. And